Hey guys, it's Courtney, and I am here with a card using the latest Simon Says stamp kit. This is the October 2018. I'm using the Sketched Flowers stamp set to create a one-layer card here. I'm stamping on a piece of Canson watercolor paper, and this is cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. I'm using my Misty here mainly because this is a large stamp and watercolor paper is textured, so most of the time you're not going to get a great impression the first time. I'm going to be stamping with Simon Says Stamp Intense Black ink. This is waterproof as well as Copic safe, and we're going to be doing some watercoloring with Distress Oxides and also some Copic coloring. Once my image was stamped down on my card panel, I'm going to be taking out the frayed burlap Distress Oxide inks. And this is the only color I'm using. I'm not doing any kind of shading here. I'm just going to smush that down onto an acrylic block. And initially I was going to go around the image, but I decided to cover up the entire image with just clean water. And then I will drop in that Distress Oxide and kind of let that just spread around. I'm concentrating my darkest area being around where the floral spray is. Here I have a little piece of cat hair stuck to my card panel. Anybody that is a pet owner knows what that's like. Once I had the color down where my flowers were, I just kept adding more water, more clean water, and letting that spread all the way across the entire panel, fading out as I got to the edges away from the flowers. Now there's a little spot there above that little squiggly flower. I don't know whether there was an imperfection in the paper, but that would not spread out. Once that color was down, it was not moving. It kind of was just stuck in the cardstock. I tried to dab it up with a paper towel. It wasn't going anywhere, but that's what sequins are for, to cover up imperfections, so we'll worry about that later. Once I had a good coverage here, I did take my heat gun and dry this a little bit. I don't dry it all the way with my heat gun. I prefer to let this air dry, but I was a little impatient, so I did at least start the drying process with the heat gun and then let that dry for about 10 minutes or so before I started the Copic coloring. I'm going to be using some neutral tones here to color all of these flowers. I've been into this vintage look for a while now, so I figured this is a good stamp set to do that with. For this first flower, I am laying out my lightest color, mapping out where my darkest areas will be, and going in with my E59, which is the darkest color, and it is a really dark color. I'm just adding a little bit of this where my shadows will be, basically where the petals kind of meet in the center. I'm not really flicking this out too much. I'm just concentrating on those very, very darkest areas. Some of these petals kind of fold over on themselves. I'm going to add a shadow for those, but I'm going to add it with my mid-tone color. I figured this dark color was just a little bit too dark for that. My darkest mid-tone is the E57, and this is where I'll start my flicking. I'll flick out that E59 just a little bit. I'm not going too far up because I still want to leave room for my next two colors. And I'm going to create that shadow where those petals are folded over on themselves. Next, I'll go in with my lightest mid-tone, which is the E55. My marker is super dry. Don't do this. Don't do what I'm doing. Don't use it if it's this dry. You're not going to get the results you're looking for, and you might ruin your nib. I don't have a refill for this marker yet, so I took the chance and I used it anyway. I'm flicking that out almost to the edge, just leaving room for my highlight. And I'll go back in with my E53 and extend those flicks out even further. I'm not necessarily going all the way to the edge of the petal because I have that base layer of the frayed burlap Distress Oxides. I'm not worried about it. I still have some color on the tips of the petals regardless how far I go out with the E53. Next, we'll move on to this flower off to the left, and I'm going to be using my E70 markers for this. Again, starting with my lightest color, just adding where my darkest colors will be, which will be in the center of the flower. There's no lines within this stamp, So I'm creating my own flicks here. So I'm just putting one long flick of my darkest color there in the center of the petals. Then I'll go in with my E74 and extend that out a little bit further. And then again, back with my lightest color, the E70, and cover up that entire area. I did create a little bit of a shadow where that one flower is kind of hanging over this one. For the center of this flower, I didn't do any shading at all for this. I just brought in a warm gray marker and filled in the entire center. Next, we'll move on to this little squiggly flower off to the left. And there's two of these, so I'll just show you how I colored one of them. As always, going in with my lightest color, mapping out my darkest areas. I concentrated my darkest areas being in the inside of each of these little squiggly lines. So I guess each of these petals, the inside of the petals. Next, I'll go in with my E18, and I'm just barely touching the tip of the marker to the paper here because some of these petals, I guess, are really tiny. I didn't want to take up too much of this space. I still wanted to make sure I left room for my mid-tone colors as well as my highlight color. Next, going in with the E15, extending all of those lines out just a little bit further. Now this larger petal, you can extend it out a little bit further than the other petals on the outside and in the inside because you have more room for that highlight. The next mid-tone is the E13. Again, just extending that out a little bit further, and then finally going back in with the E11 and just filling in those highlight areas, or the areas that we left room for a highlight anyway. Colored the other flower the same exact way. We'll move on to this flower towards the top. I'm not sure what this is supposed to be, so I just added some shading to the base of the flower as well as the little opening there on the top. I'm using my E30 markers here, E37, E33, E31, and then finally the E30. The E30 kind of blends in with the background, so you could probably skip that if you're using this color combination. There's another one of these down on the bottom, and again, color that the exact same way. Moving on to this next little squiggly flower, which is very similar to that other one that we used the E18 on. This time I'm using my warm grays, but I'm pretty much coloring it the same way, but I'm going right in with my darkest color first. The warm grays and the cool gray markers blend very well together, where I don't always find the need to go in with my lightest color first. I can typically get away with going in with my dark and then moving back to my light. So my darkest is the W7, blending that out with the W5, then the W3, and finally the W1 marker. Again, there's another one down towards the bottom, same flower, colored it the same way. For the center, no shading on this at all, just using one of my C markers. This is the C3, just filling in that center. For these little leaves off to the left, I'm going to keep my cool gray markers out. And again, like I said, these blend really well together. So going right in with my darkest color, which is the C7, concentrating my darkest areas being in on the bottom of the leaves, I guess where they meet the branch. Blending that out with my C5, then my C3, and then my C1 will be my highlight color, just mainly on these larger leaves. For these little buds or little berries, I'm going to call them berries, I'm going to go in with my E04, and I'm just putting a little dot where these little berries meet the branch. And then I'll blend that out with my E11. Now these are really, really tiny areas. You do not have to do any shading here, but I didn't want, the E04 is a little kind of like a pinky color. I didn't want it to totally look pink. So I did blend that out with my E11, and I'm pretty much just putting a little dot here. Once my coloring was done, I went ahead and stamped my sentiment with VersaFine Onyx Black ink. Now I didn't bring out my Misty for this because the lines of the sentiment are so thin. I got a pretty good impression with just stamping it once. Next, I trimmed down my panel just a little bit on the top and towards the left because I wanted a little bit of a border to show when I adhered this to my card base. I'm going to be using a Craft A2 size card base to adhere my panel to. Now, because I used so much water on the card panel, my paper did warp a little bit. When this happens, I find that using a wet glue helps to adhere this flat to a card base better than maybe like a tape runner. I tend to go for the Tabomono multi-glue for pretty much everything anyway, but I do find that it is best to adhere the watercolor paper down. Next, I'll be using some sequins that actually came in a different Simon Says stamp card kit a few months back. And I'm going to just place those around my card panel here, mainly because I needed to cover up that little smudge that wouldn't blend out. And I'm using Ranger Multi-Matte Medium just to adhere these down to my card panel. And I wanted to add a little bit of sparkle, so I took a Nuvo sparkle pen and just added a little bit of sparkle to that larger flower there in the center, as well as the leaves. That is the first card from this month's card kit. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Bye.